Come on in.
Hi, how are you?
Would you like a tea or coffee?
I'm the one that takes a coffee before sugar.
I think there's a seat over here. Give me a seat, I'll get the tea or coffee.
Hello everybody, come in, please find a seat.
Come on in and get a cuddle and a cuppa.
With all of us together, it'll be chaotically beautiful. Let us all sit and enjoy the brew and blether.
Hello and welcome to A Brew A Blether, a community-produced podcast funded by the Great Place Scheme and recorded in partnership with Erskine Arts about the lives of women and non-binary people in Renfrewshire. I'm Jules, this is Frankie.
Hello.
We're volunteers at Kairos Women Plus, and in this series we're focusing on women's heritage. By that we mean how women's lives are remembered. In this series we'll be talking about our experiences collaborating with Paisley Museum, Poorhouses and Poverty in Renfrewshire, the legacy of slavery in Scotland, and finally Section 28 LGBTQ+ education and representation.
We wanted to explore some of the more marginalised voices in Renfrewshire's history, so our focus is not just on Women Plus, but on underrepresented groups more generally, working class, BAME and LGBTQ+ folks, and the documented histories we have uncovered, or more often struggle to find. We believe that documenting the lives of marginalised groups now is the key to a more representative history in the future, so we hope this podcast can contribute to a more representative heritage sector in Renfrewshire and beyond. Content warning: this episode contains discussion of poverty, including the stigmatisation of poverty and state responses to poverty. Please be kind to yourself and switch off if you find anything triggering. This episode will cover what life was like for people in the Poorhouse in Victorian Scotland, with a focus on the lives of women. Lil Brookes, artist and social historian, will tell us more about the background to the Abbey Poorhouse in Paisley, followed by a conversation with Annie Tothill, project worker at Kairos Women Plus, exploring how poorhouses were the beginning of the state's responsibility to deal with poverty and how the lives of women were very much marginalised until the Suffragette movement in the early 1900s. We will then hear from Annie Tothill, Lynda McInally and Clarke, members of the Making Her Mark project, a collaboration between Kairos and Glasgow Women's Library, about their experiences researching the Abbey Poorhouse and the poor law records both from home and at the Heritage Centre in Paisley. Kate wrote a narrative imagining what life would have been like for two sisters that she discovered while looking through the archives, brought to life by Kairos' volunteers Ruth and Lynda. We will leave you with a reflective reading of the names of some of the women residents of the Abbey Poorhouse and asylum from the 1881 Census, whom we know existed but know very little about. Members of Kairos Women Plus today invite you to remember these women and imagine some of their stories, since no further details have been documented.
Prior to the poorhouses, such as the Abbey opening, the poor relief system was the remit of ministers, church elders and landowners. This was adequate in rural areas, but from the early 19th century did not suffice in the slum areas of towns such as Paisley. Here, many people were living in extreme poverty despite receiving poor relief, and the poor relief system just couldn't cope. The first poorhouse in Paisley was built in 1611 by the Bailies and Town Council at the east corner of what is now known as Orr Square. It initially provided accommodation for 6 old men, feeble and unable to work. The Abbey Poorhouse was built in Craw Road in 1849. An asylum block was added in 1851, a 110-bed hospital block in 1890, and then a sanatorium in 1909. Even with the strict rules and harsh conditions imposed in the poorhouse, it was still thought that you were better off in the poorhouse than begging on the streets. The daily routine in the poorhouse was regimented. Residents would have prayers before breakfast at 6 a.m, breakfast at 6:30 a.m, then work from 7 until 12. Lunch would be at 12 noon until 1, followed by more work until dinner at 7 p.m. Food in the poorhouse was mainly bread and gruel, with meat, usually mutton, served on Wednesdays and bacon on Saturdays. Older people of 60 years plus were allowed 1 ounce of tea, 5 ounces of butter and 7 ounces of sugar each week in lieu of gruel for breakfast. The consumption of alcohol, including beer, was generally prohibited, except for sacramental purposes, such as the taking of Holy Communion or for medicinal use, when ordered by the medical officer. Another exception was added in 1848, when it was allowed as a treat on Christmas Day. Poorhouses were not prisons, and work was related to physical and mental capacity to do so. For men, this might be breaking stones for metalling used in road repair and construction, or picking oakum. Oakum picking was where old ropes were recycled by picking and loosening the fibres, which could then be reused in the shipbuilding industry as material to caulk or line ship timbers and decking. For women, they might be employed knitting, sewing, weaving, or working in the poorhouse laundry. There were strict rules and regulations imposed on inmates in the poorhouse. Men and women were housed in the poorhouse in separate accommodation, and often husband, wife, and children in a family were separated down lines of gender. There were strict rules imposed on mixing between the sexes, and this harsh regime may have caused some to try to break the rules to see loved ones. For those who broke workhouse rules, there would be some form of punishment. For example, if they were caught begging on the way to church, for instance, they might have had to miss a meal. Drunkenness and fighting might also be punished by a spell in the stocks. If they refused to work, they would only get bread and water, and if they get caught lying, that diet might go on for a week. If they ripped up their uniforms or stole, they could even do a spell in the poorhouse prison. What happened to Abbey Poorhouse? In 1848, with the introduction of the NHS, the poorhouse became an annex of the Royal Alexandra Hospital, the RAH, which is the main hospital in Paisley today. The poorhouse buildings were known as the Craw Road Annex. In 1986, the Royal Alexandra Hospital was relocated to a new purpose-built building at Corspar on the site of the former Ricketts Bar Mental Hospital, and patients moved to the new facility. By November 1986, all of these annexes, including Craw Road, were closed, and in 1991 the old Craw Road Annex was demolished to make way for the private housing development Polson Crescent.
Hello everyone and welcome to our Kairos Heritage podcast series, and we're here today to talk about the Poorhouse, which was an institution in Victorian England and Scotland and Wales, where people experiencing poverty were sent to work in order to get their basic needs met, food and shelter and whatnot. And I'm here today with Lil. Would you like to introduce yourself, Lil?
Yes, I am Lil Brookes, and I call myself a social historian with a community practice, but I'm also an artist as well, living in Paisley.
Great, thank you. So someone who has a lot of knowledge on the Poorhouse, and we're going to delve a bit more into the history and kind of some of the changes that happened as the Poorhouses came in Scotland. And I'm Annie, I'm a project worker at Kairos Women Plus. Let's dive straight into some questions. So we had some context there where you told us a bit about the background to the Poorhouse, for anyone who maybe didn't know what a Poorhouse was. And I know it was, you said it was known as a workhouse in the rest of the UK, but in Scotland specifically it was called the Poorhouse. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the Abbey Poorhouse in Paisley, what you know about that, and how kind of in the 1840s the shifts in Scotland's approach to poverty in relation to what happened in Paisley.
It's quite a big question. There's a lot to it. I'll try and put it into some kind of context, really, that the 1840s in Paisley quite often referred to as the Hungry 40s, not just in Paisley but throughout the whole of Scotland. Paisley was suffering as a very successful town because there was lots and lots and lots of people coming to live in Paisley. There was a shortage of housing, there was no fresh water supply, a lot of the buildings were kind of medieval buildings, but they had this mass influx of people, people coming from the Highlands in Scotland, people coming from Ireland because there had been the famine in Ireland, potato famine, but they knew there was work in the central belt of Scotland, and particularly people who got off the train in Paisley, they thought, great, we can go and get work. But not everybody could get work, because also at the same time, Paisley's weaving industry was going through not exactly a decline, but certainly there was a shift in fashions, and weaving and making fabrics were not so popular as they once had been, especially handmade products. Were shifting towards factories. So there was a lot of people coming into Paisley, not so much work, and there was massive unemployment. Now, these people weren't native to Paisley. A lot of them maybe didn't particularly go to church. They didn't go to all the usual kind of social social areas within the town, where mostly through the church. It really is mostly through the church. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, in Paisley, the people who paid the poor relief rate were the parish. Traditionally, it had been the parish. So it was the church who organised all the poor relief for the area. And they did that by taking a rate from all the parishioners. There was also people called the heritors, and they were the people who owned property. So there was a poor relief rate that they paid as well. But because there was this mass influx of people who maybe didn't go to church, who didn't attend established church, they didn't put money in the collection plate every week when they went to church, the system went into a bit of a crisis, because there wasn't enough people paying the poor relief rate to support all these people who were on poor relief. So Paisley, it became particularly obvious because of the crisis in the handloom weaving kind of aspect of things, because there wasn't enough people paying the poor relief rate. So what did they do? There was no response to it, apart from they asked central government, they asked the Prime Minister in London at the time, who was a Tory Prime Minister at the time, and it's conservative values even then to what they are today. They believed you didn't interrupt with the economy, you didn't interfere, you didn't provide benefits for people. It would naturally sort itself out. So they weren't very keen in London to kind of get involved. Plus the fact that people who were on becoming more and more wanting to get poor relief of some type were actually able-bodied. There were people who just were unemployed. They could not get a job. It wasn't because they were elderly or they were sick. It was because literally they could not get a job to support their wife and kids or whatever it was. So that was something that went against it as well, because why would they want to support someone who is able-bodied? That's not what the poor relief was for. So there was a bit of a kind of crisis in the sense that that's how Paisley actually had quite an effect on how poor relief was actually changed, because through one thing and another, it's a very, very long and boring story, but fascinating as well. Through one thing and another, by about 1845, the crisis had actually started to sort itself out, because the economy had changed as well, and people started kind of manufacturing textiles in factories, and there was more people that work. So it kind of sorted itself out. But by about 1845, the government and the Scottish office in Edinburgh looked at everything and thought, wow, we can't go through this again. We've got to sort something out. We've got to make this a bit more regimented, where there are rules and regulations within poorhouses. There's a parochial board that's set up. We connect it more with local authorities, with councils, so that people, when they pay their rates in councils, it's part of that actually goes to the poor relief. We can't let churches take the responsibility to do this, because it's just not happening. So after 1845, you do see a distinct change, and it was really because of what happened in Paisley. Again, not to go through too much about it, but it did kind of swing things to mean that in Scotland, it was still called the poorhouse. They didn't change it to call it the workhouse. They left it as a poorhouse. It meant there was rules and regulations that you had to follow. And there was a reckoning, really, because the parochial boards in each county or each town set up their own poorhouses, and they had to look after those poorhouses. They had to finance them, and they had to make sure they were clean, supervised, regimented, and value for money for the people who paid the poor relief. The Abbey Poorhouse, to go back a long way back, the Abbey Poorhouse was built in, 1849. And when you look at the Abbey Poorhouse, if you get a chance to look at a map of it, it's done so that it's to a model that's a distinct model, a bit like a penitentiary. If you've ever seen any maps of penitentiaries, there's the entrance where you go in, you're processed, your hair is cut, you're cleaned, you're given a uniform, you're separated. The women and children go one way, the men go another way, and you go into your own specific dormitory, and that's where you live. There's a hospital. It's very, very much regimented and regulated. And when you look at a map of a penitentiary from the 1840s, and you look at a map like Strangeways in Manchester, or you look at a map of the Abbey Poorhouse in Paisley, they look very, very similar. And it's a model poorhouse of how you process people in the front door, and when they leave, they're a reformed character, or they're feeling better, or whatever, or they're basically just asked to leave because they're not following the regulations. And that's the whole point of the Abbey Poorhouse. It's almost like a process line. And it follows these new regulations that come in the 1840s. After that, it kind of then proceeds through using these. There's a whole list of rules and regulations which are fascinating, which some of them in context read out, about picking oakum, or it might be chopping kindling for men. Women, it's working in laundries or taking in sewing, that sort of thing. But the idea is that in some way you are reformed in some way. If you're a character that is an undeserving poor person, you're in some way reformed. If you're an elderly person or someone who's sick, there always has been that poor relief there for someone who can't look after themselves, and that has been there since the parishes were actually dealing with it. But for people who are they class as undeserving poor people, it's a way of reforming someone and changing them and then sending them out the door as a reformed character type thing. I don't know if any of this answers the question. I just went off there.
No, completely. I think it's really interesting that there was that distinction between deserving and undeserving poor even back then, because I think we still face that today with kind of who is worthy of state support. That's kind of still brought about as is it a choice to be living, to be receiving benefits, and who deserves the benefits and that kind of thing. But especially when you said that that there was mass unemployment at the time, when the poorhouses kind of, maybe there was a bit more of an upsurge of the use of poorhouses, and you think, well, it's not really a choice, is it? Because there was no jobs, so it wasn't like able-bodied people could go into work. So why are they undeserving of relief, of poor relief? But I think that's a significant shift, isn't it, from poor relief being provided by the church, and it's kind of more charitable, to the state actually kind of providing these institutions. And I think when you were saying about how the people are processed, I was just thinking, well, it really does seem like a prison. And even if you're told, well, you don't have to be here, the other choice is to be living in the street, so that's not really a choice.
No, it's not. It's definitely not.
Yeah, so it kind of does, to me, really brings about connotations of prisons, and even the language used, like when we looked at the census, in Making Her Mark, one of our women's heritage projects, it describes people as inmates, and that's language used in prisons as well.
Most distinctly, I mean, that's you are an inmate of the poorhouse. You're given you're given a uniform, which is quite distinct uniform, and you're meant to look after that uniform. And if you tear it or you rip it, I mean, it's a kind of case of, well, you've got to mend that, you've got to pay for that. So it was very much processed. And if you left the poorhouse, because although I'm saying, they picked oakum, or they broke rocks up or whatever, or they made kindling, quite often they would leave the poorhouse for the day to go to work somewhere locally. So by doing that, everyone knows you're from the poorhouse because you've got a poorhouse uniform on and you've got a poorhouse haircut. So everybody knows that you belong to the poorhouse, and you're going to go back to the poorhouse at night. And certainly the language. I mean, the poorhouse that we were looking at, Abbey Poorhouse, and there's the Borough Poorhouse as well, the Paisley Poorhouse, the original Poorhouse for Paisley. They certainly. It's before you get a lot of kind of medical terms. It's before psychiatry. It's before the whole idea of mental health issues. So and you saw it yourself when you looked at records for the poorhouse. It's you're not only an inmate. You're then divided up into are you a pauper, or are you a lunatic, or are, the language is like wow. It kind of takes your breath away when you look at this. Or are you an imbecile? These are the classifications you've got, and that classification went with these regulations I was talking about that came in after 1840s. That went with it because by being classified in some way, you then get certain, well, for want of a better word, privileges, certain things that you maybe didn't have to take exercise, you maybe didn't have to take on work if you were classed as an elderly pauper. You were then you don't need to, you can stay in bed for 20 minutes longer or whatever it was that they decided at the time, but that classification also got you your food and how much food you got, all this sort of thing. So the undeserving poor bit is definitely, it's people that they classify as they're able-bodied and they should be able to work. Undeserving poor is more for people who have maybe got some kind of mental health issue through addiction of some type, and there's no way that they're getting around that they are anything but undeserving poor in the eyes of the parochial board. They should be working to support themselves. They should be working to support their family. What are they doing in such a state that they end up in the poorhouse? So it's quite black and white, really, But I mean, in England they were called workhouses because at the same time as the 1840s, when they changed things in Scotland, they also changed them in England. But they changed the name in England to be away from like almshouses and things like that to workhouse, because they wanted the focus to be on the fact of, if you're in here, you are working. You're not getting bed, board for nothing. You have to work. And that was why it was called a workhouse. And it was meant to be, going back to like Oliver Twist kind of type things and Dickens type period, where it was like to put people off wanting to go into the poorhouse or workhouse. I mean, who would choose to actually want to do this? I don't understand that, but in their eyes it was a kind of case of, this is too easy a place to live. We're giving them food and we're giving them board. No, they've got to get told this is a workhouse. Scotland, it stayed with poorhouse because they did definitely look towards more, it's a place that is where the poor reside. And that's part of the whole kind of stigma that goes with it as well. You would not want to go into the poorhouse because you were known to be in the poorhouse and from the poorhouse, or you'd spent time in the poorhouse. So it was more the kind of stigma attached to England. It was more, in Wales, it was more the workhouse, so that people were put off trying to get into the workhouse. But certainly the whole stigma attached to it as well, very much a stigma attached to it. And that's why even years after it, you would hear people saying when they were on benefits, oh, I don't want to go in the parish. And it all goes back to the idea of being on the parish is, it's the parish books, it's the poor relief. So that it must have went on for quite a long while, this whole, because even when I was younger, people would call it being on the parish, and you were actually on an unemployment benefit, and they called it being on the parish.
So that language stayed.
So it stayed all that time,
despite it being shifted from provided by the church to provided by the state. There was still that connotation of
still all the connotations,
the parish,
and the stigma of it and the shame of it. Very much so, But again, I mean, going back to the benefits, that today, it's kind of, you should be working, therefore, to get benefits, and you're able-bodied. Why haven't you got a job? Well, in the 1840s, it was the exact same. So nothing changes under the sun. There was people who were perfectly able-bodied in the 1840s, but they just could not get a job because it was mass unemployment, and they were having to go everywhere to try and get any kind of form of money, and the government didn't actually provide it. It was more like charities again that provided it, and people within the town of Paisley itself, putting their hand in their pocket, trying to put money together for a relief fund, and holding concerts and things like that to try and raise money that they could actually hand out to people who, in normal terms, would never be given money because they were able-bodied, but there was literally mass unemployment. They just couldn't do it. So that's where I go back to this. They had to change the whole kind of system and kind of start to regiment it. And that's the beginnings of the whole benefit system. That's the kind of beginnings of it in the 1840s and 50s, and looking at, how you actually provide for people when there is no employment. It's mass unemployment. Otherwise they slip right into poverty, and there's children and, well, I'm saying women and children, but women would not have been the main breadwinner, so it was always like women and children always lumped together type thing, but it's because they wouldn't be seen as being the breadwinner, even though we all know most working class women would do some kind of form of work. They would take in sewing or washing or whatever it is, but it wasn't formalised, I have got a job type thing, so...
And not to mention housework.
And housework,
raising, child rearing and education and...
all that.
All the 1,000,001 jobs you'd have to do to keep a household functioning.
But it wouldn't be seen as paid employment, so therefore it's valueless.
Well, yeah, so actually that leads on quite well to considering the next question, which is about why it's important to consider the lives of women who lived in the poorhouse. Just because in the Making Her Mark project, we talked a lot around, what are the stories of women in the poorhouse. We looked in depth at certain individuals, trying to pull out more than just a name and a date, trying to actually look into stories. And it's incredibly hard to find that background of working class women in Victorian Scotland, but we've done our best. And so just like, why do you think that's important to look at?
Well, it is difficult to find women in any kind of, they tended not to be writing diaries, or if they were, they've been destroyed diaries. It was maybe all more word of mouth, women being the people who maybe hold family stories, but it's all word of mouth. They don't write diaries. The only place that you can really find women popping up are in like census returns. Or the value of looking at poor relief records is because you do capture women at that point. And unfortunately, it's a case in point for working class women at that time. If you had your children and your husband went walkabout, or he died unfortunately, and you were left a widow, you were very much, you were on your own type thing. And trying to bring up children and maybe hold down a full-time job to pay the rent, to do all the different things, impossible. And there was no social work department or anything like that at that point. It was a case of you were on your own, and you relied on your family. So if you didn't have a family to help you out, you were stuck. So quite often the only way that you find working class women, the only place to find them really and get any kind of depth of understanding of their story, is in the poor relief records. And that's why they're invaluable, the poor relief records. And it's very important to see the fact that it confirms what you maybe already kind of thought. When you look at a whole load of these records, the women are often elderly widows. They have no husband. There is no pension. There's no state pension at that point. They kind of are classified really, or maybe a younger widow or someone who's been deserted. There's quite often you'll see that the husband has gone, or he's maybe immigrated to America to try and find work. When he'll ever come back or send money back, did he or didn't he? Who knows? But why would they be in the poorhouse otherwise? And quite often they've got several children. So it's women and children and elderly women who are widows. They cannot look after themselves because the social norms at that time, there was no things set up to help them out apart from family. And if you haven't got family, or you haven't got family willing to help you, that's you. You're stuck. But trying to find women in historical records who are working class women, very, very difficult to do. As I say, that's why it's important to look at the poor relief record, because quite often there's so much information in the poor relief records, you can build up a story around them, and you can find out, there's quite a lot of information sometimes written within the records that can fill out their story a wee bit. Or, I mean, quite often you'll find it's orphan children. It's children that their mum has had to go off maybe and get work elsewhere, or their mum has died, or their father has died, and that they're left, and these children are boarded out to various different institutions as well. So it is difficult finding women, working class women at that point. It's particularly Victorian times as well. It's the best place to look is the poor relief records. As I say, the only other things you've got are things like diaries. And quite a lot of women, it's middle class and upper class women that will keep a diary. Or you quite often find servants for some reason, like maids will keep a diary. And sometimes you can find, domestic servants who've made a diary, but it's not really that regular. But it's very important to look at women within the records as well, because we don't just want to hear the male story, we want to hear what women were doing, and the massive part that they played within families itself. So that's why I would think, it's a good thing to look at. That's the whole point of making her mark, that the Heritage Project was to try and give voices to women who otherwise nobody would even know they existed. They're just forgotten. So again, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, totally. No, I think that's exactly what we were going for with when there was a visit to the Heritage Centre, and people, I think, got quite moved by looking back at the histories and thinking, I never learnt this at school, but also, this might have been someone I was related to, or this could have been me if I was born then. And I know certainly people have said to me, can't imagine having lived in that time. And it's important to know that history, because we do talk about kind of history repeating itself, and as you said, some of the ways people experiencing poverty now are viewed as not deserving of social security. But I think it's definitely something that we want to delve further into, but it's just so difficult too because of the lack of documentation. And that's why now we're trying to document the lives of women we work with and working class women in Renfrewshire, because there needs to be something for future generations to look back on that's more than just this person was in receipt of this much money a week and, just to do with their destitution. Because people have so much more to life than just the struggles that they're going through.
I totally agree. I think that's a great idea. I really do. Good for you.
Well, part of this podcast series is hopefully an attempt at that, but then we also have like the Kairos Chronicle, where anyone can write a contribution, including Lil, you've written several. So just trying to get those ways of documenting voices out there and out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, again, I could go on about my favourite person, Jane Arthur, but I won't. Apart from the fact that by the 1870s, you've got the kind of suffrage movement, and then you're moving on towards, the beginning of the 20th century and the suffragette movement, and there is much more. That's when you start seeing working class girls beginning to get a voice, because they start kind of getting unionised. And that's when you start seeing some of these, the Annie Besant and things like that, that they start getting a voice, and they are totally working class girls. So that's where you see the change. And it's really 1870s is the beginning of Fawcett and the whole kind of suffrage movement, and women beginning to get positions within like council boards and things like that. So they start getting a voice. And to me, that's when it starts to change, is from about 1870 onwards, I think, anyhow. And you start seeing voices, but they're quite politicised in a lot of ways. And then you end up, it's the suffragettes and all that leads on from that. So that's quite a kind of pivotal point, I think, anyhow, is the suffrage movement. And I know I could go on about Jane Arthur. I could do a whole podcast just on Jane Arthur. But she's a very, very privileged lady, a very grand and privileged lady. But at the same time, she did go into the whole kind of suffrage side of things. She did believe that women did deserve some kind of voice. She did get onto the Council Education Board, and she was voted onto that by the people from Renfrewshire. So that is quite a distinct difference, and that's the 1870s, and that to me is a kind of pivotal point in political terms. And by the 1890s and 1800s, you've got the working class girls. The match girls had went through a whole strike in London. So there's a whole load of things all kind of beginning to kind of happen. The mill girls in Paisley begin to kind of come together. So that's quite an interesting and exciting point in time where working class people do start to organise a wee bit, and women within that group start to get a voice. And then ultimately you've got the suffragettes and what happens after that. So again, I've went off completely. Sorry.
Well, no, I think it's quite a good tangent to think about kind of what was that shift about. Like how did people who, as you said, were just kind of maybe ignored in society or very at risk of destitution and very voiceless, how did they go on to kind of build power? And I know you mentioned unions, but do you have any kind of reason you think that kind of happened in the 1870s after such a period of kind of being ignored?
The ladies that we were looking at, I mean, it was 1881 we were kind of looking at, and I think it's just like today. I think it's very easy to go from being able to manage to being in poverty, and most of it's to do with having a job. In a lot of ways, not having a job can really throw you where you can't pay your rent, you can't pay your mortgage, say, you can't pay your car payments, you get all this sort of thing. So it is very easy for it to happen, just as it was in the 1880s. For me as well, the thing that begins to change is in Scotland in 1872, you've got the Education Act, and that's education for all children. You must send your children to school, albeit it's elementary school, it's up to the age of 12, and then you're expected to go into an apprenticeship and work, etc. But in that time period, it mobilises a whole load of young people. They're all taught to read, write. Some of them, there is always the people within any group that is taught the same normal things. There's the ones that go off on a tangent, who will do things like saying, no, I'm not accepting the way things are. And to me, education is part of it as well. And that whole kind of ground force of education, unionisation, people coming together to understand, that life doesn't need to be the way it was for our parents, sort of thing. So you always get the catalyst within it, the people who move things forward. That again is what I think anyhow. You've also got maybe not so much for working class women, although you don't know. There's the Married Women's Act, where women begin to be seen not as the chattel of their husband, but the property that they own, it belongs to them. It doesn't automatically go to their husband. So there's a Property Act as well, which helps probably more like middle class women. But again, it's all it's filtering down towards working class women as well. And as I say, by 1890s, you've got the different strikes that are going on, and also it's because women were in jobs, working class women who were in jobs were unskilled. They classed them as unskilled because they hadn't went through an apprenticeship. They weren't like a qualified joiner or whatever it was. Very rarely did you get anything like that, unless it was within a family that taught their daughters how to do things. They were unskilled labour. So unskilled labour until about the 1890s were not unionised, because they were seen as it's unskilled labour. Or it's seasonal labour, all these sort of things. But they start to begin to get organised by the 1890s. But for me, it's education as well, and a growing awareness of positions within society, understanding that. And that only can happen through things like education and more awareness, really, again. And I'm talking all about girls, but I mean, boys as well. But certainly for the women who were in the poorhouse that we looked at in 1881, etc., these were people. It's very easy to go from having to have not, and a lot of them, the people in the ladies in the poorhouse that we looked at, it's because their husband had gone off or their husband had died, and they were not seen as the breadwinner. They were probably not able to actually earn enough money. Again, unskilled labour, you wouldn't get the same wages. Again, it's a bit like today. A lot of women do service work. They don't earn as much as a man, or even some people who are in the same jobs. It's like now been found out they don't get paid the same.
There's still a gender pay gap.
Yeah. So it's all under the sun. Has anything actually changed? heck of a lot has changed. I'm glad I live today, and I don't live then. But there are still things that you can see, gaps that you can see, and that's again the power of history, as far as I'm concerned. That by looking backwards, you can see what's happening today, and you can actually try and change things for the future. So maybe that's what women in those days were doing. Maybe they were doing the same thing as me.
Yeah, could they be sat at school thinking about the past and
what can we do to change the future? So very powerful.
Yeah, no, that is powerful, and I think just talking about the power of education, and just I think what you said there about people kind of realising their own position, that sounds like it was really crucial to people getting organised in whether it's their workplaces or in the suffrage movement, and I think just like having that understanding that I'm actually experiencing oppression, and it's not okay that my husband died and now I have to live in a poorhouse and rely on these people for money when actually I was doing quite well in my household and keeping it all together. I think it is kind of really important that we look back on these changes, because maybe when we're losing hope today and think, oh well, how could that ever change, we think, well, there was a time where people did live under a poorhouse, had to wear these uniforms, had to work for no money and just for their keep, and women were just treated as like the property of men, and we have to realise that shift didn't happen out of nowhere. Women fought for that, so in the same way now, things that we want to fight for, we can.
Oh, it's definitely having that was another reason for the whole making her mark as well. It's looking at history, but with a female voice, and it's quite distinctly different when you talk to women and how you're even saying about the ladies who took part in making her mark, how they were quite emotional about these records that they saw. That's with a female voice. That's history with a female voice. Is it herstory they were calling it at one point? It is starting to look at history from a different slant. It's in a lot of ways history. When you read normal history books, it's you could say, well, it's kind of boring in a lot of ways. But if you look at it from a slightly different viewpoint of how women have experienced that's the same set of events, it's quite distinctly different, I find it very, very interesting because their voices are not heard, and that's where this kind of the herstory kind of thing that's happened over the last couple of years has been really refreshing, because it is looking at history from a slightly different viewpoint. The whole idea of the statues, there's no statues or very few statues to women. It's usually like Queen Victoria or whatever it is. And there's been a whole movement, not only just for female representation, but a whole load of other things as well. How do we change that? And why is it always like that? And these are questions which are they need to be asked type thing. And that's quite refreshing to have that, because that again is how it moves on, and we gain a different understanding of things. And we kind of start to go, it's not written the old dusty old books that we all read of history, which were dead born. There is a new kind of history, and that's the kind of interesting and exciting bit. And things like this, the kind of podcast that you're doing, is looking at it from a different viewpoint. It's a different voice that's looking at things, and that can be the refreshing bit, and the really quite, dare I say it in inverted commas, revolutionary part of it is that you're moving things on and you're looking at things slightly differently. And I think anyone that's listening to the podcast will go, wow, that's a different way of looking at things. I would never have thought about it like that. And that's quite a revolutionary and quite a radical thing to do. So there you go. That's it. Sorry, I went off again at a tangent. Sorry.
Well, no, I think that's quite a good way to kind of draw all of the conversation to a close. But it's definitely not just kind of women. Like, as you said, we're talking about representative history. We've talked in this series about LGBTQ plus histories and queer history and the representation and seeing yourself in history and how important that is for your identity. And the same with like migrant histories and black histories and how difficult these are to actually look into now, and that's why we need to document what we're doing today. But yeah, I agree totally with you that we need to kind of have such a more critical look at history than maybe certain school curriculums do, and I hope that as time goes on, school curriculums change, but also we know there's opportunities in our communities to do that education ourselves. Like, as you said, you're a self-proclaimed social historian, and I think we can all actually learn the skills to do research and meet together in groups and talk about what was life like for someone like me 100 years ago, because we can't sit around and wait for like the institutions to do it for us. So yeah, I think I'm just backing you up there, Lil.
Yeah, it's quite revolutionary. It's quite a radical
revolutionary.
Well, I like being revolutionary. I might not look like a revolutionary, but at the same time, it's how you push things forward. You have to have the people who are the iconoclasts almost, who go, no, I'm not going to accept that. I'm going to go and do X, Y, and Z. Or in some way, if you're making podcasts or you're making a film, but you're saying it with your voice, and that voice can be, as you've said yourself, the Black migrant history. There's LGBT history, things that they don't get. There's no voice for it. But if you make a film or a podcast, you have a chat with people, you have a chat among yourselves. It's a new voice, it's a new perspective, and that's quite a powerful thing. And that's where, again, I've always thought history was a very, very powerful way of doing that, because it kicks conversations off, and people start going, oh, wait a minute, it wasn't like that for me. That my granny didn't feel that way, or my mum didn't feel that way, and that's the kind of powerful bit. And bringing people together to have this voice is actually a very, very radical and revolutionary thing to do as well, and it's a very powerful thing to do. And that's where you get people who do the normal kind of blah 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 kind of conversations about history. They don't like it because it's actually quite a powerful thing, and it's coming from the grassroots up. Oh God, there you are, I really am a revolutionary now. Crikey, there you go. But I don't know if that answers anything.
Yeah, definitely, Lil. Well, thank you so much for being here, and I think
pleasure.
We can take away that, it's a radical act. Learning women's heritage is a radical act. So,
yes.
And thanks for everyone who's listened today to our podcast, and we hope you go away and find out some of your own community or family or working class history. Great, thank you.
Before, I didn't really think much about other people, to be honest, and I didn't think much about history either. But when it's brought down to a local basis and you realise all this happened in this area, and there's people still today needing help, needing financial help, needing help with food, needing help with anxieties and mental health and all sorts of things that we can all contribute to.
At first, I didn't think I was going to like it. It was just not my thing. But when we got there and they brought the books out, ancient books that we were looking at, that we could have been the first person to look at that, it actually got written, that just fascinated me. And that's what got me into it, and just wanted to do more than it was just, we didn't want to go for a break. I just wanted to keep looking, and it was really, really interesting. So looking up
records when we went to the Heritage Centre at the Anchor Mill, and we were only there once, and it was just...
I loved it. It's just the fact that you're looking at this and you could be the first person looking at it if somebody wrote it, and then finding the ladies, and then finding sisters, looking into their children and how it was back then. 2-year-old babies dying, and it just made you, what did they die of? So you would search for more.
We discovered 2 sisters, and their last place, they had been itinerant. They had been tramping the countryside, and the last place they had stayed was on a stairhead, or as we'd say, Paisley stairhead, in Backsnedden Street. And our most recent excitement is we found a tenement building.
It's the right one, but
so that that's where they stayed before they had to go
on the landing. they were actually falling asleep on the landing. What was it they say? Was it tramping?
Tramping, and I'd always thought that you think of tramps as men in past times, but one of the sisters, both they hadn't had a house of their own since their husbands had died. One of them, her husband had died in another poorhouse, and so for 13 years tramping around to Falkirk and Dundee and back, and what led them to feel the only solution for them or the way was to go to the poorhouse. Both of them had daughters who were sent to Canada, who went into care and went to Canada probably, I think it was as domestic servants.
On the night of the 24th of April 1911, Catherine Hughes, aged 56 years, and Margaret Hodge Thompson, aged 63 years, slept on a stairhead in Backsnedden Street in Paisley. This location was a stone's throw from Abbey Poorhouse, where they were to lay their heads the following night.
Stairhead, Backsnedden Street, Paisley, late on Monday the 24th of April 1911. Two sisters carried down together in the stairhead. They're old and move slowly and stiffly. The older of the two has a consistent nagging cough.
Come on, Hen, let's get in for that rain. You're drook it.
I don't know if I can take another night like this. My chest is that sore. I can hardly get a breath. Never mind climb these stairs. I'm exhausted, Kate.
Oh, give me your bundle. That's it. Here's my arm. Now take your time.
What's going on out there?
Sorry, missus, we haven't anywhere to go tonight. We'll be away this morning. Sure we will, Meg.
It's pouring out there. Look at us. We'll be out of here in the morning, all right?
You'd better be quiet, will you? I don't want my man to hear you.
Aye, all right then.
What a green face she is.
Wheesht, Meg, and try stop coughing all the time.
I'll try.
Oh, Hen, I ken you do.
I'll try.
Sitting on your mammy's knee, greeting for a wee bobby to buy Mercoulter's candy.
Wake up, will you, Meg? We have to get away from here this morning. Yon woman will begin his jip.
I will. But give me time to get moving. You know, I'm that stiff in the morning. What's your hurry anyway? I'm not sure about this at all.
Look at us, Meg. We're all sore and starving. It'll have to be the Poorhouse for us. It's the only thing we can do. At least we'll be together. Come on, Hen. Here's my arm.
Working poor wee mammy day, I give them a penny between them twain to buy Mercoulter's candy.
Later in the day, Tuesday the 25th of April 1911, the sisters were registered at Abbey Poorhouse in Paisley. For both sisters, the entry about character was deemed to be doubtful.
Sitting on your mammy's knee, greeting for a wee bobby to buy Mercoulter.
At least we'll have a clean bed tonight. I can't wait. But what's that matron like with her rules? Rules. Another green face if you ask me. Is this too for them?
Aye. Did you see what they wrote? Doubtful? Doubtful? What have I got to be doubtful about? Och, I don't know.
hunting for a wee bobby to buy mere coulter's
During our research for the Making Her Mark project, we were given access to these massive handwritten record books in the local heritage centre. There were records of the people who had become residents at the Abbey Poorhouse. This had had a huge effect on us. We were absolutely floored, seeing the hundreds and hundreds of pages of human beings, their existence reduced to a few lines on some paper. For some, an entire life story could be found in that book. For many, there was simply a name and an age, nothing more. Now we're going to take a moment to pause and remember some of the women we found in those books, to the women who came before us.
Agnes Andrew, 26, Beath. Susan Gisland, 56, steamship stoker. Anne Boyd, 45, domestic servant, Paisley. Margaret Boyle, 41, mill worker, Ireland.
Mary Fletcher, 44, winder, Johnston. Agnes Hay, 17, from Mearns. Agnes Hill, from Glasgow. Helen Houston, 44, a mill worker from Paisley.
Elizabeth Algie, 37, Ireland. Jane Allison, 60, Greenock. Elizabeth Appleyard, 27, cotton mill worker, Glasgow. Elizabeth Appleyard, 1, Glasgow.
Catherine Carmichael, 79, washer, Oban. Margaret Christie, 63, winder, deaf and dumb, Paisley. Margaret Clarke, 67, wife of saddler, Paisley. Elizabeth Clements, wife of cotton spinner, Wishaw.
Janet Fairley, 69, wife of boatman, Edinburgh. Margaret Ferguson, 4, Govan. Sarah Fields, 29, Johnston. And Forsyth, 51, mill worker, Barhead.
Letitia Graham, 87, Winder, Ireland. Elizabeth Haggerty, 44, wife of Riveter, Ireland. Esther Hamilton, 63, outdoor worker, Paisley. Agnes Hart, 80, wife of harness weaver, Paisley.
Thank you so much for listening. We've been A Brew A Blether, a Kairos Women plus community produced podcast. If you like what you've heard, you can follow us on social media, all the usual places, or you can look at our website, kairoswomen.org, and I'll spell that out for you. It's KAIROSWOMEN. If you have any questions or comments on the series, we would love to hear from you. Please get in touch.
This series was made possible through the Great Place Scheme, a project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and delivered through Renfrewshire Council. The music you've heard is by Lakbay Lahi, the song Pag-ibig, which means love in Filipino. Love is central to our ethos at Kairos, and a lot of love and volunteer time goes into all of our projects. Thanks to the guests and volunteers who gave their time to make this podcast happen.